this video, we will go through 12 murder cases that took place on the Appalachian Trail. In 1974, the Appalachian Trail saw its first recorded murder. The victim was 26-year-old hiker Joel Polson, who had been traveling with 18-year-old Margaret McFadden. The two stopped for the night at Low Gap Shelter in Georgia, where they encountered another camper, Ralph Howard Fox. By morning, the situation turned deadly. Fox shot Polson, stole his hiking gear, and kidnapped McFadden. She was held for several days before Fox unexpectedly let her go. Once freed, McFadden went straight to the authorities and gave a detailed account of the attack. Fox was quickly arrested, charged, and later pleaded guilty to the murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. In 1975, a brutal killing shattered the quiet of the Appalachian Trail. Hiker Janice Balza was spending the evening at the Van Deventer shelter in Tennessee, sitting by a campfire with other hikers. Without warning, she was attacked with a hatchet by Paul Bigley, a former mental patient later described by authorities as severely unstable. Investigators said Bigley wanted her backpack. Balza died at the scene. Bigley was arrested, tried, and convicted of murder. He spent the rest of his life behind bars. Today, hikers still pass through the Van Deventer shelter, but the spot carries a dark reputation. Some say the place is haunted by Balza's ghost. A lingering reminder of the night violence came to one of the trail's most scenic stops. In May 1981, two 27-year-old social workers from Maine, Robert Mountford Jr. and Laura Susan Ramsey, set out on a section of the Appalachian Trail with a purpose far beyond recreation. They were hiking to raise money for troubled adolescents back home, a cause that meant something to them both. Their trek brought them to the Wapiti Shelter in Virginia, a stop that would become the scene of one of the trail's most infamous crimes. While staying there, the pair encountered 28-year-old Randall Lee Smith. At some point during the night, Smith attacked. Days later, searchers found their bodies still inside their sleeping bags, buried under dirt and brush. Both had suffered knife and gunshot wounds. The motive has never been made clear. Smith was arrested and charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. He was sentenced to 30 years in prison, but served only 15 before being released on mandatory parole for good behavior. What makes this case even more unsettling is what happened next. Years after his release, Smith returned to the same area and attempted to kill again, confirming the fears of many who had questioned why he was ever set free. The story of Mountford and Ramsey's murders was chronicled in the 1984 book Murder on the Appalachian Trail by Jess Carr, cementing the case as a grim reminder that even in the quiet beauty of the Blue Ridge, danger can walk right into camp. In May 1988, 28-year-old Rebecca White was camping with her partner, Claudia Brenner, in Michaud State Forest, Pennsylvania. The two women crossed paths with 22-year-old Stephen Roy Carr twice that day, first at a public restroom, where he asked White for a cigarette, and later when they stopped to check their map. That evening, after the couple had set up camp, Carr watched them from a distance. Then, armed with a .22 caliber rifle, he fired 8 shots into their campsite. White was killed instantly. Brenner, though seriously wounded, managed to hike 4 miles for help. Carr was captured 10 days later. Prosecutors labeled the killing a hate crime. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the years that followed, Brenner became a prominent advocate against anti-gay violence, turning her personal tragedy into a platform for change. In September 1990, the Appalachian Trail saw one of its most shocking crimes. Jeffrey Hood, 26, and Molly LaRue, 25, were a young couple through hiking the trail, living their dream of walking from Georgia to Maine. They spent the night at the Thelma Marks shelter near Cove Mountain, just outside Duncannon, Pennsylvania. By morning, both were dead, shot and stabbed in a brutal attack. Their killer was Paul David Cruz, a drifter already wanted in Florida for another murder. Cruz was mentally unstable, struggled with manic depression, and had a long history of drug abuse. He had crossed paths with Hood and LaRue in the shelter, and without provocation, turned their final night into a crime scene. For 8 days, he stayed on the move. His run ended when hikers in West Virginia spotted him acting strangely and struggling under an overstuffed backpack that didn't seem to fit. Inside that pack, Jeffrey Hood's pack, were both murder weapons and the victim's personal belongings. Cruz was arrested, extradited, and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. He was convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms, with no possibility of parole. Over 30 years later, he remains behind bars, a stark reminder that even the most remote corners of the Appalachian Trail aren't immune to real-world violence. In June 1996, the quiet trails of Shenandoah National Park turned into the scene of one of Virginia's most disturbing unsolved crimes. Julianne Williams, 24, and Lolly Winans, 26, were experienced hikers who had set up camp along the bridle trail, less than a quarter mile from a busy area with bars, restaurants, and rental cabins. On June 1st, their bodies were discovered at the campsite. Julie's father, Thomas Williams, had alerted authorities after his daughter failed to return on the day she had planned. What followed was a homicide investigation that drew the attention of the FBI and the national media. To this day, no suspect has been arrested. The motive remains unclear, the killer unidentified. The case is still open, and the FBI continues to investigate nearly 3 decades later. In November 2001, 52-year-old Louise Chaput left her home in Quebec for what was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway in New Hampshire's White Mountains. She checked into a lodge at the Appalachian Mountain Club's Visitor Center in Pinkham's Grant and planned a short afternoon hike on the Lost Pond Trail, a route that began just across the road from where she was staying. She never came back. When she failed to return home or contact anyone, her friends and family reported her missing to local police. Search teams combed the area for days. On Thanksgiving Day, her body was found along the trail. She had been stabbed multiple times. The investigation quickly turned into a homicide case, but authorities were unable to determine a motive. There was no sign of robbery, and no suspect was ever identified. More than 2 decades later, the murder of Louise Chaput remains unsolved, and her killer is still out there. In January 2008, 24-year-old hiker Meredith Emerson set out with her dog for a day on Blood Mountain, Georgia, a popular but challenging section of the Appalachian Trail. On the trail, she encountered Gary Michael Hilton, a 61-year-old drifter who would later be identified as a violent predator. Hilton hiked alongside Emerson for part of the ascent, but she was an experienced and fast-paced hiker and eventually left him behind. Hours later, on her way down, she crossed paths with him again. This time, Hilton was armed with a knife and a baton. He threatened her and demanded money. Emerson wasn't an easy target. Trained in 2 forms of martial arts, she fought back hard. Hilton later admitted to investigators she wouldn't stop fighting. Despite her resistance, Hilton overpowered her and took her captive. For 3 days, Hilton held Emerson, moving between locations in North Georgia. The ordeal ended when Hilton killed her using the handle of a carjack. Investigators described Hilton as mentally unstable and a likely sociopath. He told police he targeted Emerson simply because she was a woman. Convicted of her murder, Hilton was sentenced to life in prison. In the years following, he was linked to and charged with 3 additional killings, cementing his place among the most notorious killers to ever haunt the Appalachian region. In 2008, 2 fishermen, Scott Johnston and Sean Farmer, set up camp near the Wapiti shelter along the Appalachian Trail. That evening, they met a man who introduced himself as Ricky Williams. He seemed friendly enough, and the pair invited him to share dinner. What they didn't know was that Ricky was actually Randall Smith, the same man who had murdered Robert Mountford Jr. and Susan Ramsey in the very same area back in 1981. Smith had served time and been released, but his past was far from behind him. The 3 men spent hours talking over a campfire meal. Smith mentioned that his own campsite was more than an hour away, but he lingered well into the night. At about 8:30 p.m., he finally said he was heading out. Seconds later, the gunfire started. Smith opened fire on Johnston and Farmer at close range. Both men were hit, but in a stroke of pure luck, they managed to escape together and survive. Smith was later captured, returned to prison, and died there. On August 12, 2011, a group of weekend hikers discovered the body of 30-year-old Scott Lilly near the Cow Camp Gap shelter in Virginia, along the Appalachian Trail. Lilly, known on the trail as a southbound, Sobo hiker, had started his trek in Maryland and planned to finish at Springer Mountain in Georgia. The last confirmed sighting of Lilly was on July 31st, after he climbed the Priest in Nelson County. Less than 2 weeks later, his hike ended in tragedy. The medical examiner determined his death was a homicide caused by asphyxia by suffocation. When his body was found, some of Lilly's belongings were missing. However, the FBI has not publicly stated that robbery was the motive. More than a decade later, the circumstances of his death remain unsolved. No suspects have been named, and no arrests have been made. The case is still open, and the FBI continues to request information from anyone who may have seen Lilly during the last days of his hike. In the summer of 2013, 66-year-old Geraldine "Jerry" Largay, known on the Appalachian Trail as Inchworm, set out to thru-hike the entire route alone. A retired Air Force nurse from Tennessee, she had been in regular contact with her husband, meeting him at planned points along the trail for resupplies. While hiking through Maine's remote 100-mile wilderness, she stepped off the trail one morning for a quick break and couldn't find her way back. Cut off from cell service, she tried repeatedly to text her husband for help, but the messages never went through. When her husband stopped hearing from her, he contacted authorities, triggering a massive search. Despite those efforts, Jerry remained lost in the dense backcountry. She survived on her own for 23 days before dying from exposure and starvation. Searchers found her remains 2 years later, just 3 miles from the spot where she was last seen. In May 2019, tragedy struck the Appalachian Trail in Wythe County, Virginia. 43-year-old Ronald Sanchez Jr., a retired U.S. Army veteran who served 3 tours in Iraq, was on a long-distance hike he had dreamed about for years. Injuries to his knee and shoulder meant he moved at a slower pace than most, but that didn't matter. He was out there for the experience, not the speed. By May 10th, Sanchez had reached southern Virginia, camping with 3 other hikers for the night. The next morning, the group crossed paths with 30-year-old James Lewis Jordan of Yarmouth, Massachusetts, known on the trail by the nickname Sovereign. Hikers later reported that Jordan's behavior was erratic and threatening. According to witnesses, he told the group he would burn their tents. When they tried to leave, the situation escalated. Jordan attacked, killing Sanchez and seriously injuring another hiker before fleeing into the woods. Authorities quickly apprehended Jordan. He is now undergoing psychiatric evaluation while awaiting trial. The killing shocked the hiking community and served as a stark reminder that danger can appear even in the most remote and peaceful places. The Appalachian Trail is generally safe, but it's not free from the risks found elsewhere. Over 3 million people hike it each year, and since 1974 there have been 11 murders, about 1 every 4 years, making the chance of being killed on the trail less than 0.03%. By comparison, Chicago, with a similar population size, recorded over 900 homicides in 2020 alone. Most deaths on the trail are caused by heart attacks, medical emergencies, drowning, or falls, often from risky behavior for photos. Other dangers include tick-borne illnesses, dehydration, lightning, and falling trees. Hikers are urged to take basic precautions, travel in groups, log in at every shelter, and stay in touch with friends or family through calls, texts, or tracking apps like Cairn or satellite messengers such as Garmin InReach. Report suspicious individuals without engaging them, and avoid sharing personal details or itineraries. Firearms are legal if state and local laws are followed, though the ATC discourages carrying them. Always carry a map, conserve phone battery, and check forums and weather updates when possible. Preparation, awareness, and common sense are key to a safe and enjoyable hike on the Appalachian Trail.